Welcome back, class. For this week's lecture, we're going to be talking about the constitutions that have governed Texas. We're going to talk about the role of the Constitution, the number of constitutions that have governed Texas, how each of them have changed, kind of what they were meant to do. Before we begin, there's a couple of terms that you need to know. The first is simply Constitution. A Constitution is defined as the legal structure of a government that establishes its power and authority, as well as limits or places limits on that power. So the Constitution will tell us, or will tell the government, what they can do, but it also tells us, along with the government, what the government cannot do. State constitutions function in this capacity for political institutions of the state. So the state constitution will tell the other political institutions, meaning the branches of government, what they can and cannot do, what powers they have. Texas has had many constitutions, and they all owe much to the American experience. Simply put, this means that they borrowed many ideas from the American Constitution. There are 5 ideals which link the Texas and the American constitutional experiences together. So there are 5 ideals that we borrowed from the U.S. Constitution. The first is the thought that political power is derived from the people. This idea comes from Locke and Hobbes. If we were to look at Locke and Hobbes, we would find our social contract theory. Hobbes stated government comes into being when people give up some of their rights and they agree to be ruled by a government. Locke, however, took this concept a step further. He said, yes, people do give up some of their rights when they create a government. However, people reserve the right to rescind their social contract. They reserve the right to take back these rights they've given up if the government oversteps its authority. If the government, I don't want to say misbehaves, but if the government abuses their position, the people reserve their right to change governments. Political power. Political power is going to be divided into branches. We see this idea from Montesquieu. The Constitution, both the state and the federal, call for political power to be broken into 3 separate branches. These branches are the executive, legislative, and judicial branch. Each branch has its own powers and responsibilities. But how do you prevent one branch from becoming too powerful and taking over the other 2? This was a fear that our framers had. So the idea here is that we're going to have something called checks and balances. Montesquieu, look above, political power and branches, this is Montesquieu. Montesquieu said government can be controlled by separating the power into various branches, but giving them some overlapping functions. What would some examples of this be? Montesquieu says that to keep one branch, or to keep these branches from becoming too powerful, you give them this separate but overlapping functions. This means that for government to work well, for government to accomplish anything, the different branches, the various branches, have to work together. An example of this at the state level would simply be passing a law. What do we see? We understand that it is the job of the Texas legislatures, the legislative branch. They pass laws, they pass legislation. So does this mean if they pass it, it becomes a law? No, this is where we have that overlapping, the separate but overlapping functions. The state legislature has to pass the law. However, it then goes to to the governor's desk, and he gets the option to approve it. So if he signs the law, it becomes a law. Everybody's happy. They had to work together. In Texas, it is odd because the governor has the option of not signing a bill, but also this does not mean he didn't veto it. If the governor chooses not to sign the bill, it'll still become a law. But the governor has to interact one way or the other. It has to go from the legislative branch to the executive branch. This would be an example of checks and balances. The next idea is that the government cannot violate the rights of the people. The role of the Constitution not only states what a government can do, it states what a government cannot do. For people to be free, there must be certain rights which exist. What are some of these examples? What are some of these things that the government cannot violate? Well, an example would be freedom of religion. We are free to worship whatever religion we choose, or we are free to not worship a religion at all. The government can't dictate to us that we have to practice a certain religion. They can't authorize a state-sponsored religion. All these freedoms are left up to us. We have the right to free speech. Within reason, there are certain times that the government can limit what we can say, but we have the right to freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press. These are some of the rights that the government can't violate. That these are some of the rights that we find protected in the Constitution. Then we have federalism. Federalism is an idea that is found in the U.S. Constitution. Federalism is a system of government in which power is divided by the Constitution between a central government and a regional or a state government. The two different types of governments share and exercise authority over the same body of citizens. So they have authority over the same people. The U.S. Constitution guarantees a Republican form of government. This means that we are going to elect our government officials. It means that federal government is going to outweigh, or going to be more important. They're going to have more sway than state government. However, our U.S. Constitution does reserve some power to the states. How do we know that the states must take a subordinate role to the federal government? How do we know that federal government outranks state government? There is something found in Article 6 of the Federal Constitution called the Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause states that all laws and treaties passed by the national government are the supreme law of the land and superior to all laws adopted by any state or any subdivision, so any lower level of government. So this means that, yes, federal ideas, federal laws, federal court decisions trump state. They outweigh, or they are more important, whatever term you want to use. They outrank state decisions. This is why states have to follow the feds. This idea of federalism was reinforced twice in history. The first time was with the resolution of the Civil War. This indicated that the United States was and would remain a perpetual union of states subordinate to the central government, rather than a confederation of autonomous sovereign entities. At the end of the Civil War, we had to once again agree that the federal government was the ruling level of government and promise that we would not secede again. The second way this idea was reinforced also had to do with the Civil War. And this was due to the passage of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment laid the groundwork for the incorporation of the Bill of Rights. Once again, Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, to apply to all of the states and not just the federal government. We've talked about the Supremacy Clause, and this dictates, or this tells us, that the federal government outweighs or outranks the state government. But in the U.S. Constitution, we also see something called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And this is found in Article 1, Section 8. This gives Congress the authority to make all laws which are necessary and proper to carry out its expressed power. This clause provides a constitutional basis for the expansion of central government power in the federal system. So this means what the federal government can do is our Congress can state, well, we don't have the expressed right. It is not said in the U.S. Constitution that we can do this, but using the necessary and proper clause, if it helps us carry out our expressed powers, we are allowed to do so. The writers of the current Texas Constitution were reluctant to provide such broad discretionary powers to our state government. They were reluctant to give such power, such a wide brush. There is really no way to indicate, or that for us to know with the necessary and proper clause, what the limits are of federal Congress, We don't know. The framers at the state level, those who wrote our state constitution, said, no, we don't want to give that much power to our government. We're actually going to attempt to limit it. Okay, we have the federal constitution, which gives powers to the federal government and leaves other powers to the state. This is done by the 10th Amendment. 10th Amendment says, this is the Reserve Powers Amendment. It simply says any powers not given to the federal government nor prohibited to the states are reserved for the states or the people. So 10th Amendment, Reserve Powers Amendment, says that any powers not given to the federal government are prohibited to the state, are reserved for the state. We see a lot of issues when we see people arguing back and forth about whether it is a federal power or a state power. The argument's going to be 10th Amendment. If it's not the states' rights, the 10th Amendment people are saying the framers did not intend for the federal government to have this power. If they did, they would have put it in the Constitution. They would have expressly said you can. 10th Amendment states that the states reserve this power if it is not given to you. The federal government will usually claim, given the necessary and proper clause, we can expand our power. Okay, we've established that feds have power, and we've established that the states have power. The federal government has power due to the Constitution. The states have power due to the 10th Amendment. But is there a big, bright dividing line between these two? Is there something which states, federal government, you can do this, state governments, you can do this? No, there's nothing that indicates what power is reserved for what. Which power is reserved for what level of government. No bright line, there's nothing that says, yes, you can do this, no, you can't do this. So how do we know if a federal act violates a state's rights or if a state act violates the Constitution? Simple. We have to ask the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court must rule on this. Why is the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, the federal or the final decision on these questions? Go back to the Supremacy Clause. Any decision, so any law created by the federal government or any decision by the federal court will dictate what the lower levels of government do. So if that gives the Supreme Court the power and the ability to dictate that the federal government, what powers they have and what powers the state has. Let's actually start to get into the Texas constitutions. During the history of Texas, and what I mean history, this refers to the time that we were a territory, a nation, and finally a state, we have been covered by 7 constitutions. Each constitution was shaped by the political climate of the day and a desire to rectify problems that were found with the previous system of governance. Our first constitution was the Constitution of Coahuila y Tejas. So we are part of Mexico. Actually, we are part of Spain. In spite of attempts at rebellions in the early 1800s, Texas remained a part of New Spain until the Mexican War of Independence. This war was sparked by Spain's massive extraction of wealth from the colonies during the Napoleonic Wars. Spain was using Central America to finance their wars, the silver mines, gold mines, whatever they could find. After a series of revolts and guerrilla attacks, Mexico finally gains independence from Spain in 1821. Because Texas was a part of Mexico, we first operated under the Mexican Constitution. So for this Mexican Constitution, at the national level, this Constitution created a bicameral legislature. Bicameral, means two. It means two. So it creates a bicameral legislature. Congress has 2 houses, and a Supreme Court. The president and vice president were elected by the state legislatures. Local affairs remain pretty much independent of the central government. They didn't get involved. This first constitution that we're under, the Mexican Constitution, was very similar to the American Constitution. The main difference is that while we were under the Mexican Constitution, the Constitution of Coahuila y Tejas, we actually see that Catholicism was established as the national religion. Under this Constitution, or this is the only time that we had a national religion, that we were forced to be part of one religion if we were a Texas resident or a citizen of Texas. Texas was a part of the state of Coahuila y Tejas, and its constitution was published in 1827. The state constitution divided the state into 3 separate districts. Our legislative powers were given to a unicameral. What does that mean, bicameral? Remember that bicameral meant two houses. So unicorn, unicycle, whatever. Una means one. So legislative powers were given to a unicameral legislature, which consisted of 12 deputies that were elected by the people. The executive power was vested in a governor and a vice governor who both served 4-year terms. We had a court system under this Constitution. Judicial power was placed in state courts. The Constitution guaranteed citizens the right to liberty, security, property, and equality. Under this Constitution, we do see some constitutional language that supported an effort to curtail slavery, but it was still an accepted practice. There are a couple of other important ideas that came from the Mexican Constitution. The first was the idea of a homestead exemption from bankruptcy. Remember, Texas was a big state at this time and it wasn't very well populated. Stephen F. Austin recommended an idea to the state legislature of Coahuila, Texas. What happens today if you can't pay your bills? You can declare bankruptcy. What is one of the things the creditors cannot seize if you declare bankruptcy? One of the things they can't take is your home. Stephen F. Austin realized a couple of things. He realized, A, we needed more people, but he also realized that along the east coast of the United States, economic times were hard, people were losing their jobs, they weren't making enough money. Banks were actually foreclosing on these people's homes. So what he recommended was that a moratorium be placed on the collection of Anglo-colonist, of white colonist, debt to foreign creditors. Simply put, what this means is that if people from U.S. citizens came from the United States, agreed to become a Mexican citizen, and start a new life in Texas, any homestead property created in Texas, so any property given to these people to settle, could not be seized to pay their debt back in the United States. So their creditors could not come in, seize the land that Texas, or basically Mexico, gave them to sell, to pay off or to pay down their existing debt. Why is this important? Think about it. If you owe somebody money, are you going to do anything? Are you going to move? Are you going to buy a new house? Are you going to buy a new car? If you know that sometime at a later date, your creditors, the people you owe money to, can come in and seize this from you to help pay your debt, you're not going to do anything. This idea was important because it told people in the United States, come help us settle Texas, i.e. Mexico, but come help us settle Texas, and in return, we will protect your investment. We will create a law that states nobody can take this land away from you. Your home will actually be and remain your home. The other idea that was promoted under the Constitution of Coahuila, Texas was the idea of communal property. What's communal property? Communal property is simply property that is shared between a husband and a wife. It is shared property, it's property that they get together. Why was this needed? If you think about it, what was life like back in the 1820s? It was hard. Farming, ranching, whatever. It was hard. Life expectancy between the wild animals, the wild critters, the Indians, the Native Americans. Let's face it, the male never knew if they were coming home at the end of the day. With the idea of communal property, if something were to happen to the husband, the property would then pass on to the wife. She was able, under this Constitution, to own property. Why would this be an important idea? Why is this a neat aspect? This provided a protection. This provided a guarantee to the wife and to the children. If something were to happen to the husband, to the father, the family could remain in the family home. They could work the family farm. They could continue to make a living. What would happen if women weren't allowed to inherit property? Well, if the deceased, if the male had a brother or a farmer or father, whoever, the property would go to them. Does that mean that he has to let the wife and the children stay on the property? No, he could have kicked them out. This idea of communal property provided some sort of protection for the family. The last thing this Constitution did was actually promote education. While it never came out and directly addressed a statewide school system, the school system would be a subject of intense interest in subsequent constitutional conventions. The Constitution of 1836 is our second constitution. When Texas broke with Mexico, it was due to the culmination of a growing sense of discontent over Texas's place in the federal system. They were unhappy that the federal government, located down in Mexico City, was able to make all these decisions and dictate to Texans or Texas what they would do. Some of the things that Texas wasn't happy with and that we wanted to change, Texas was demanding liberalized immigration policies. Everyone who immigrated to Mexico, so everyone who immigrated to Texas, had to become a Mexican. They had to become a Mexican citizen. They had to follow all the rules. This meant that you had to convert to Catholicism. People in Texas realized that this was actually hurting immigration. This was preventing people from immigrating from the United States into Texas/Mexico. Another thing that Texas wanted was they wanted a change in schools. They wanted to see English and Spanish both taught in schools, whereas under Mexican rule, the only language taught, or the only language that education was given in, was in Spanish. The Texans wanted to see that changed to that it was taught in both English and Spanish. So we didn't have the choices back then like we have today about what language to speak, what religion to practice. The Mexican government was very strict. Stephen F. Austin went to Mexico City and requested a relaxation of these rules. How do you think the Mexican government responded? Did they take it well? No, they threw him in jail. They were not happy with what the Texans, or what would become known as Texans, wanted. In response, they imprisoned Stephen F. Austin, and this actually pushed Texas and Mexico closer to a break. So in 1836, we have a constitutional convention at Washington on the Brazos, where Texas declared independence from Mexican military and religious tyranny. Borrowing heavily from Locke and Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, or the Texas Declaration of Independence, included a list of grievances against Mexico, arguing that the government had abdicated its duties. Our new Constitution was very brief, less than 6,500 words, and it was very flexible. It established an elected chief executive with considerable powers, a bicameral legislature, a four-tiered judicial system, which was composed of a justice, county, district, and Supreme Court. We saw that power was divided among the three institutions, the three branches of government. And a system of checks and balances was put into place. It was implemented. Amendments were very difficult to make to this new Constitution, and a Bill of Rights was included. In this Constitution, not the Constitution of Coahuila y Tejas, in the Constitution of 1836, we also see the institution of slavery protected. And what I mean by that was that language was put in to this Constitution legalizing slavery. Now, when this Constitution came around, most of the Texans, we took a vote, and about 75% did not want to join the Union. Did not want to become a nation. They wanted to become a state in the U.S. However, the U.S. would not let us. They did not let us join until 1845. So we finally become a state. What was some of the reasons what was the main reason, given that the U.S. did not want Texas to become a state until then? It was because we were a slave state. We allowed slavery. Remember, at the federal level in the United States, slavery was a dividing issue. They were trying to keep a balance between slave states and non-slave states in the Congress, the U.S. Congress. So states were implemented and were invited in pairs. One was a slave state, one was a non-slave state, to keep the balance, to make sure slavery or anti-slavery people did not gain an upper hand. So finally, after 9 years as an independent republic, we are invited and we agree to join the United States. So we have to write a new constitution. So in this new constitution, it was twice as long as the previous constitution, and it included the following provisions. We have a bicameral legislature, so we still have two bodies in our legislature, the House and the Senate. We have a popularly elected governor and a lieutenant governor, so these people are voted for by the people. We have an appointed judiciary that consists of the Supreme Court, district courts, and what are called lower courts. Appointment powers were given to the governor. These include the power to appoint the Attorney General and the Secretary of State. However, all appointments were subject to the approval of the Texas Senate. All appointments were subject to the approval of the The Comptroller of Public Accounts was still appointed and overseen by the Texas legislature. Our treasurer was elected every 2 years. Amending our Constitution remained difficult. Other provisions in this Constitution said that if Texas decided to, it could divide itself into as many as 5 states. The agreement for us to go into the U.S. to become a state was it required Texas to pay its foreign debts. How come? These were debts that were accumulated while we were not part of the United States. So the U.S. government said, you have to pay these yourself. We are not going to accept your debts. However, for us, the U.S. government did something it didn't do for its other territories. It allowed Texas to retain title to its public lands, so we could keep our public lands. The idea was Texas would sell its public lands, therefore paying down the debt that it owed. We had fiscal conservatism back then. The Constitution stated that the total accumulated state debt could not be more than $100,000. Remember, back then $100,000 was a lot of money. We did keep the homestead protection, and we did keep the community property rights for married couple. So we did carry on these ideas from our previous Spanish roots, our previous Spanish Constitution. Our next Constitution was the Constitution of 1861. What issue caused Texas to leave the Union and join the Confederacy? Simply put, it was slavery. Slavery had become vital to the Texas economy, and slaves made up 30% of the state's population. Pressure to secede mounted after Lincoln was elected president, but the question of succession divided Texas among regional, ethnic, and partisan lines. Governor Sam Houston actually did not support secession. He did not want Texas to leave and join the Confederacy. But we had a secession convention, and Texas voters in February of 1861 approved the idea of leaving the Union. So a new constitution was drafted, protecting the institution of slavery, and the reference of the United States of America were replaced simply with the Confederate States of America. The Constitution of 1866. After the defeat of the South in the Civil War, the renegade states had to write new constitutions to be allowed back into the Union. The structure of government outlined in the new Constitution was similar. It looked like what we had between 1845 and 1861. A couple of the changes: the state lost the right to secede. The war debts incurred by the state had to be paid by the state. And we saw the abolition of slavery. Slavery, it was done away with, period. The Constitution of 1866 granted freedmen rights to the freed African Americans and their persons or property. It gave them the right to sue, to be sued, to enter into contract with others. However, they were still denied the right to vote and the right to hold public office. Basically, all the changes were very small in stature. I mean, the big ones were forced upon us or were dictated by federal law. What was the changes in the actual U.S. in the state constitution were very small. The governor's term was changed from 2 years to 4 years. It changed the method we selected our comptroller and the treasurer. So we are going to now elect them in popular elections. Not a whole lot. Our next constitution was the Constitution of 1869. In 1869, a constitutional convention assembled in Texas to meet the requirements of the Congressional Reconstruction Acts of 1867. The Republicans at the federal level felt that the South had not been punished harshly enough for their actions, so they want to see additional things done to the South, or they want to see additional changes in the South. Democrats were opposed to the convention, but radical Republicans, this was a bloc of Republicans in the U.S. Congress who pushed through the adoption of African American suffrage, as well as an extended period of military occupation in the South following the Civil War, easily won. They were able to get their ideas through. Certain features of the 1869 Constitution stand out. Once again, we see that the U.S. Constitution is declared to be the supreme law of the land. Slavery is forbidden. African Americans are given the right to vote. We also saw that the 14th Amendment guarantees of equality before the law were recognized. What this meant was that African Americans were supposed to be treated the same as Anglos. In this new Constitution, the three branches of government were altered. The number of legislators was changed. The executive branch was given more power, especially with respect to appointments. The size of the Supreme Court was reduced. And finally, state officials, their salaries were increased. This new Constitution, remember I said that the Democrats didn't participate. They were not happy with it. So this new Constitution went into effect after it was published under order by military officials. Our new governor was a gentleman by the name of Edmund Davis. He was a Republican and a former Union general. He was sent down here from the north by the Republicans up north, and he served as governor under this new Constitution. He was not well liked. He was a Republican, but some have also said that his administration was corrupt and extravagant. It is rumored that he used the state police and the militia to maintain his power, to maintain his regime. Not everything in this new Constitution was a negative. Schools were a high priority, and the existing school fund was to be financed by receipts from a new poll tax, plus 1/4 of annual taxes. So we start to see money set aside for education. The position of the state superintendent was kept, and state attendance was made compulsory. So the Constitution of 1869 is kind of the last straw. Republicans are pushing it on it. Democrats are upset. They said we're taking our ball and we're going home. But what the Republicans did not realize, the Republicans at the federal level did not realize, they were trying to get rid of the Democratic Party in the South, and it was going to fail. So finally, once again, in 1872, the Democrats regained control of state government. Governor E.J. Davis, Governor Edmund Davis, was kicked out of office. We elect Richard Koch, and this led to us rewriting the Constitution.